Laura Clark never imagined she'd be here, in a luxury hotel ballroom, her seat labeled Single Mother Waitress. Her son, Ethan, was excited for her brother Mark's wedding, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Still, for Ethan's sake, she pushed aside her discomfort. What she didn't know was how this night would change everything. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked between an electric bill and an old magazine, as though it didn't belong in the same pile. Laura stared at it for a moment, fingers tracing the edges of the heavy paper, the gold lettering shimmering under the dim light of her small kitchen. Her heart sank slightly. She hadn't heard from her brother, Mark, in months, and here was an invitation to his wedding. The same wedding that she wasn't entirely sure she was supposed to attend. She stood still for a moment, considering the envelope, the heavy weight of it mirroring the weight she felt in her chest. Mark's wedding was one thing, but the world he was marrying into was another. They'd grown up in the same house, but their lives had veered off in opposite directions. Mark had always been the one with potential, the one who was always good with people, the one who had found a way into the world of finance right after college. Laura, on the other hand, had spent years picking up pieces of her life after a failed marriage, trying to make ends meet, working as a waitress at a local diner. She never imagined this would be her life, but it was. And now, she was supposed to step into his shiny new world for a wedding, one where she wasn't sure she belonged. She set the invitation on the counter and turned away, grabbing a glass from the cupboard. As she poured water, her mind wandered. Mark's fiancée, Claire, was everything Laura wasn't: young, polished, successful. The kind of woman who could walk into any room and instantly make everyone want to be her friend. Claire had probably never struggled with anything in her life. Laura had no idea how she would fit into that world. She imagined walking into the reception hall, feeling out of place in the sea of expensive dresses, surrounded by well-to-do relatives who wouldn't even look her way. But then there was Ethan. Ethan, her 6-year-old son, was her reason for doing anything anymore. He had been the light of her life since the moment he was born, and her heart ached when she thought about his happiness. He'd asked about his Uncle Mark more than once, and she knew how much he wanted to go. The boy was too young to understand the complexities of family dynamics, but he loved his uncle, and he deserved a chance to see him get married. Laura sighed, the weight of the decision still pulling at her. She couldn't just let Ethan down, could she? She couldn't explain to him that they couldn't go because she didn't feel like she belonged there. She knew how much Ethan wanted to be part of the celebration, and for that reason, she resolved to go. She would make it work for him. But she couldn't deny the storm of emotions brewing within her. She had no idea how she was going to survive this. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Laura tried on a few dresses in her modest closet, each one seeming too fancy or too plain for the occasion. Finally, she settled on a simple navy blue dress she'd worn to a few family gatherings before. It wasn't anything special, but it would do. She didn't want to draw attention to herself anyway. The less she stood out, the better. When the day of the wedding finally arrived, Laura tried to calm her nerves. She put Ethan in his best little suit, complete with a bow tie that she'd struggled to get on him. Ethan was excited, his little face lighting up as they headed out the door, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The drive to the wedding was long, the tension in the air thick. Ethan chattered on about his favorite cartoons and his school friends, his innocence giving Laura a fleeting sense of peace. She could almost forget about the wedding for a moment, imagining a day of happiness and celebration. But she knew that once they arrived, everything would come crashing back. As they approached the wedding venue, a large, grand building with shimmering windows, the sense of unease returned. Laura felt like a small fish swimming in a vast ocean of unfamiliar territory. The elegant marble floors, the towering chandeliers, the expensive cars parked outside, it was all too much. She held tightly to Ethan's hand, his small fingers warm in hers, and tried not to let her discomfort show. They were escorted inside by a member of the venue staff, the space around them feeling more foreign by the second. The room was filled with guests in lavish attire, laughing and clinking glasses, their lives far removed from hers. She felt like an imposter, a part of her wishing she could vanish into the background. Ethan, however, was in awe of the decorations, the flowers, and the spectacle that surrounded them. She smiled at his wonder, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Here's your seat," the staff member said, handing her a small, polished card. Laura glanced down at it, and her heart immediately sank. Her name was neatly printed at the top, but the title beneath it read, "Single Mother Waitress." She froze, her throat tightening as her eyes scanned the room. Other guests were seated at tables with their family names on them, clearly labeled with honor and respect. But not her. Her seat, the one that marked her as an outsider, made her feel small. She swallowed hard, trying to calm herself. She was stronger than this, wasn't she? She had to be. But as she sat down, Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, what does it say on your seat?" His words were innocent, too innocent. She forced a smile, trying to brush it off, but inside, her heart was breaking. "It's just a little mix-up, sweetie," she said softly, glancing around the room quickly to make sure no one had noticed. But she knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a mix-up. It was a reminder. A reminder of who she was in their eyes, a single mother, a waitress, someone who didn't belong in their world. And as she looked around the room, seeing the proud families and wealthy guests, she couldn't help but feel the weight of that truth settling heavily on her shoulders. Ethan was chattering away, oblivious to her inner turmoil, but for Laura, the moment had already been marked. This day, which was supposed to be about celebration, was instead a harsh reminder of everything she had lost. And yet, she smiled, as best she could, for her son's sake. Because that's what mothers did. They smiled when their hearts were breaking. The wedding had just begun, and already, it felt like she was sinking deeper into a place she didn't recognize. The days leading up to Mark's wedding felt like a blur. Laura tried to keep her mind occupied with the usual routine, work, picking Ethan up from school, making dinner, but everything seemed to circle back to the upcoming event. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that invitation again, the words, "Single Mother Waitress," etched into her mind like a permanent stain. She didn't tell anyone about her worries. There was no point. Her friends, all of whom were in similar positions as her, had their own struggles and wouldn't understand the complex feeling of not fitting in with your own family. They knew her as a hardworking mother trying to make a life for her son. But what if they could see her the way Mark's fiancé did? What if they could see her the way her family had always seen her, as someone who had failed, as someone whose life hadn't turned out the way it was supposed to? Laura shook off the thoughts and focused on Ethan. He was bouncing around the apartment in excitement, his bright smile making everything else seem insignificant for a moment. "Mom, do you think Uncle Mark will let me play with his wedding presents?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. Laura smiled and ruffled his hair. "I'm sure he will. But remember, it's a special day. We have to be on our best behavior, all right?" Ethan nodded seriously. "I'll be on my best behavior," he said with a grin. "I want to be a good guest." Laura laughed, the sound light and free, something that hadn't come easily in a long time. She wasn't sure what made her laugh more, the way Ethan earnestly tried to understand the weight of the occasion or how genuinely he wanted to be a part of it. She tried not to think about how the reality of the situation would soon hit him. They weren't just attending a wedding, they were stepping into a world neither of them really belonged to. As the day of the wedding arrived, Laura found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting the navy dress she had chosen. She had tried on so many different outfits, but nothing felt right. The dress was simple, understated, and while it looked nice on her, it didn't feel like enough. She wasn't sure what she had expected, a fairy tale gown perhaps, something that would help her blend into the world she was about to enter. But it didn't matter. No matter what she wore, she would still be the same person. The same waitress, the same mother, and the same woman who had once believed in something more. "You look beautiful, Mom," Ethan said, his voice full of innocence and love. Laura turned to him, and for a moment, Everything else faded away. Ethan was wearing a small blue suit, a little too big for him, but he looked so grown up. He had the same hopeful expression on his face as he had when he first started asking about the wedding, the same light in his eyes that made Laura feel like she had to hold everything together. "Thanks, sweetie," she said, her voice catching slightly as she crouched down to adjust his tie. "You look very handsome, too. Just like your uncle." As she worked on his tie, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy for him. Ethan didn't have the burdens she did. He had no idea of the world he was stepping into, no concept of how different their lives were from the people in that ballroom. And she wanted to keep it that way. She wanted him to walk into that room with the same innocent confidence he carried every day, believing that he was just as deserving of happiness as anyone else in that room. The taxi ride to the wedding was quiet, the sound of the engine humming beneath them as the city skyline faded into the distance. Laura tried to steady her breathing, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't shake. She kept glancing at Ethan, whose face was pressed against the window, watching the city whiz by. "Are we there yet, Mom?" Ethan asked, his voice full of excitement. "Is it going to be a big party?" "It's going to be a big celebration," Laura said, trying to match his enthusiasm. As they neared the venue, her stomach clenched tighter. The hotel was a grand building, towering over the city, its stone steps leading to an entrance that looked like it belonged to another world. Laura couldn't imagine ever being part of it. She wondered how many people like her had walked through those doors, their lives and struggles hidden behind the polished walls. The moment they stepped out of the taxi, the full weight of the situation hit her. Ethan bounced ahead, skipping up the marble stairs without a care in the world, while Laura hesitated for a moment, taking in the opulence that surrounded her. The massive glass windows, the tall, polished columns, the guests arriving in evening gowns and tuxedos, it all felt so foreign. The air smelled of expensive perfume, and the clink of glasses from the inside reached her ears. This wasn't her world, and for the first time, she felt it deep in her bones. "Come on, Mom," Ethan called, his little voice bringing her back to the moment. She took a deep breath and followed him, her feet heavy as she walked toward the entrance. The receptionist greeted them with a practiced smile, though her eyes flicked down to the seating chart before scanning it again. Laura could feel the tension in her chest, tightening with each passing second. They were led into the ballroom, the vast space filled with guests already mingling, the noise of laughter and conversation mingling with the soft strains of classical music. The staff member handed Laura a small card, her face impassive. "This way, please," she said, leading them to their table. Laura's heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the name card in her hand. It wasn't the one with her last name or even her first. It simply read, "Single Mother Waitress." The words seemed to mock her, echoing in her mind as she tried to suppress the shock that was threatening to rise to the surface. Ethan, unaware of the significance, looked up at her. "What does it say, Mom?" "It's just a little mistake," Laura said, her voice tight as she forced a smile. She quickly placed the card down and sat down, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. The wedding had only just begun, but she already felt like an outsider. The room seemed to grow colder as Laura sat down, the weight of the seating cards still heavy in her hands. The plush chairs around her, the pristine tablecloth, and the glimmering crystal glasses only served to highlight how out of place she felt. She glanced around at the other guests, the ones sitting comfortably with their family names etched on their cards, names she didn't recognize, names that felt like a world apart from hers. They chatted with ease, laughing and toasting, while she clung to the faint hope that this would somehow feel less uncomfortable as the night went on. Ethan, oblivious to the tension building in his mother, tugged at her sleeve, his eyes wide with excitement. "Look, Mom. They have a whole table of sweets." He pointed across the room, his excitement infectious as he bounced in his seat, ready to explore the new world he found himself in. Laura managed a smile, grateful for the distraction. She followed his gaze, nodding in approval. "Yes, sweetie. That looks like a lot of treats. Maybe we can go over there after dinner." Ethan's eyes sparkled, but his joy seemed to only remind Laura of the reality of the situation. She wasn't like these people. She wasn't wealthy or well-educated. She wasn't part of their world, and the sting of that truth pierced her again. She had spent her life working hard for every dollar, scraping by as a waitress, trying to raise her son in the best way she knew how. The life she had was simple, but it was hers. And now, here she was, seated at a table where the label didn't just describe her job, but who she was in their eyes, a single mother, a waitress, someone who didn't fit in. She couldn't stop herself from glancing at the other tables. There were families talking easily among themselves, laughing over shared memories. There were people dressed to the nines, their conversations filled with topics she could never engage in. At one of the nearby tables, a group of women were talking about their children's Ivy League acceptances, their words a reminder of how far apart her life was from theirs. Just then, her brother Mark and his fiancée Claire entered the room, greeting their guests with bright smiles. Mark looked the same as he always had, confident, in control, the kind of person who belonged in a place like this. His tuxedo fit him perfectly, and Claire beside him looked every bit the elegant bride, radiating beauty and grace. They were the picture of success, the kind of couple Laura had never been able to relate to. She tried to focus on her son instead, watching as Ethan tugged at his tie and asked if they could go get some ice cream later. His innocence gave her a brief moment of relief, but it didn't last long. Mark's eyes scanned the room, his gaze finally landing on Laura. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He smiled, but there was something behind his smile that made her uneasy. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile that people give out of politeness, out of obligation, without true warmth behind it. Laura smiled back, but it felt forced, as if she were trying to pretend everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. Claire, too, spotted them and waved from across the room, though her smile seemed to falter when she saw where Laura was sitting. Laura couldn't quite place it, but there was something in the way Claire's expression shifted, something almost like pity. She quickly averted her gaze, as if realizing her moment of discomfort had been noticed. The room slowly began to fill with the soft murmurs of conversation and clinking glasses. The reception was in full swing, and Laura tried her best to ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach. Ethan was excited about the food, asking her when they could go get some snacks, but Laura couldn't bring herself to indulge in the same carefree joy. She felt like an outsider, and no amount of pretending could change that. The music swelled as the waitstaff began to serve the first course of the meal. It was all so elegant, so polished, and she couldn't help but feel small in comparison. As the first round of appetizers was passed around, she glanced at her plate, wondering if the next course would be anything more than just a reminder of how different her life was from those seated at the other tables. The dinner conversation was mostly superficial, people talking about vacations, their jobs, the best restaurants in the city. Laura found herself nodding along, offering polite comments when prompted, but inside, she was shutting down. She had nothing in common with these people, nothing to offer beyond the pleasantries. No one seemed to care about her story. They were all too busy discussing their perfect lives, their perfect families, and Laura wondered if she was the only one who saw through the facade. Ethan, as always, was the light in the room for her. He was eating his meal with gusto, chattering away about everything he saw, his face alight with joy as he soaked in the experience. He had no idea that his mother was silently fighting to keep her composure. He was blissfully unaware of the judgment in the eyes of the people around them. To him, this was just another day, another event, and he was determined to enjoy it. Laura glanced across the room again, her gaze landing on her brother and his fiancée. They were smiling and laughing with their guests, clearly in their element. Mark looked so different now, so far removed from the brother she used to know. She could barely recognize him as the same person she had grown up with, the one who used to play video games with her, who had helped her with school projects. Now, he was a successful man, engaged to a beautiful woman, surrounded by people who had everything she didn't. The disparity between them was too much to ignore. And then, as if on cue, a family member from Mark's side approached the table. He was older, with graying hair and a jovial smile, and he immediately launched into a conversation with the people around him. When he noticed Laura, however, there was a brief moment of hesitation. "Ah, you must be Mark's sister," he said, as though trying to place her. His eyes flicked down to the label on her seat. "Single mother waitress, huh?" "Interesting," he remarked, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Laura's heart sank. There it was again, the label. She knew it was meant as a casual remark, but it stung more than she cared to admit. She forced herself to smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Yep, that's me," she replied, her voice tight, unsure of what else to say. As the conversation continued around her, Laura felt herself retreating into her own world, the sounds of the reception becoming muffled as she tried to focus on anything other than the sharp discomfort in her chest. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that nothing about this day was going to change. She could smile and pretend, but deep down, she knew this was her reality now. She was never going to be a part of this world, not truly. She was just someone who had been invited out of obligation, a woman with a label that would always follow her. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom seemed to grow even more extravagant. The soft glow of candlelight reflected off the polished silverware, and the air was filled with the quiet hum of polite conversation. Laura tried her best to keep her attention on Ethan, who was happily nibbling away at his food, his small voice filling the silence between them with innocent observations about the various people and decorations he found fascinating. Despite her son's cheerful chatter, Laura couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that lingered around her. The smile she had put on for him earlier had begun to feel brittle, like a mask that she was afraid might crack at any moment. Every time she glanced around the room, she was reminded of her place, how she was different from everyone else there. The staff moved gracefully between the tables, offering drinks and refilling glasses, while Laura sat at her own table, trying not to feel the weight of her label. The discomfort in her chest had now settled into a quiet, constant thrum, and no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, it wouldn't go away. It was as if the label, single mother waitress, had taken on a life of its own, following her around the room like a shadow. She knew it was just a name on a card, but it felt like more. It felt like an accusation. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her dress once again, trying to keep her focus on Ethan as he leaned over to whisper something to her. "Mom, can we go see the big cake?" he asked, eyes wide with excitement. Laura smiled warmly at him, her heart swelling with affection for her son. Ethan had no idea what was going on in her mind, and that was one of the things she loved most about him. He lived in his own world, full of wonder and curiosity, untouched by the weight of adult problems. She gave him a gentle nod, trying to focus on him, trying to let go of her thoughts. "Of course, sweetie. We can go see it after dinner, okay?" she replied, her voice gentle, though the weight of the room pressed on her shoulders like 1,000 unseen hands. But even as she spoke, she couldn't ignore the glances from some of the other guests. They weren't loud or overt, but there was something in the way they looked at her, something that made her feel like she was a character in a play, performing for an audience that didn't understand her. She could feel their eyes darting to the card on her table, and then to her dress, her hands, her demeanor. They all had questions written on their faces, and none of those questions were ones she wanted to answer. It wasn't just the staff or the guests, though. Laura could feel the weight of the evening pressing down on her with each passing moment. It was in the way Mark and Claire moved around the room, so comfortable and assured in their world. Mark had greeted her with a smile earlier, but it had been a brief acknowledgement, and the distance between them had been undeniable. They were no longer the same people they had once been. He had his new life, and she had this. Laura's eyes briefly locked with Mark's across the room. He was standing near a group of guests, laughing at something Claire had said. The expression on his face was bright, filled with joy, and for a fleeting moment, Laura couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She had once hoped that her relationship with Mark would be different, that he would understand her struggles, that they would be able to talk about the hardships she faced, the pain she carried. But now, it seemed like that bond was lost, replaced with the image of the successful man in the tuxedo, standing proudly beside his beautiful fiancée. Claire caught her gaze and waved, but the wave felt more like an obligation than a genuine greeting. Laura returned the gesture weakly, feeling the awkwardness between them stretch thin. It wasn't that she didn't like Claire, she had never really gotten the chance to know her, but it was clear that Claire was part of a world that Laura would never belong to. And for the first time in years, Laura felt the crushing weight of that fact. Her thoughts were interrupted when the dinner course arrived, and the waitstaff began serving the next round of food. The clinking of plates and glasses filled the room as conversation resumed, but for Laura, the moment felt like a blur. The food, no matter how carefully presented, couldn't distract her from the quiet ache that had settled deep in her chest. She was surrounded by people who had everything, it seemed, and here she was alone in her own thoughts, disconnected from the world around her. Ethan, sensing his mother's growing discomfort, suddenly reached across the table and took her hand in his. His small fingers wrapped around hers, and for a moment, everything else faded. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked quietly, his voice full of concern. Laura blinked, startled by the simple question, but as she looked into her son's face, something inside her softened. Ethan wasn't worried about the wealth in the room or the labels that were placed on people. He wasn't concerned about appearances or social status. He only cared about her, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she felt like she might burst into tears right there at the table. But she couldn't. Not in front of these people. Not in front of Ethan. "I'm okay, sweetie," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Just a little tired, that's all." Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response, and went back to his meal. But Laura wasn't able to shake the feeling of being so deeply out of place. Her fingers traced the edge of her wine glass absently, her thoughts drifting once again to the unspoken tension that simmered beneath the surface of the evening. Just as she was about to take a sip of her drink, Laura felt the weight of the moment settle on her once again. It was then that she noticed Mark and Claire moving closer to the front of the room, where the speeches were about to begin. The crowd shifted in their seats, murmuring in anticipation, and Laura found herself, once again, sinking into the background. For the briefest of moments, she imagined walking out of the room, leaving all the pretense behind. She could just slip away, take Ethan's hand, and disappear. But she didn't. She couldn't. She was here for him, after all. And despite the weight of the evening pressing down on her, despite the feeling of being an outsider, she couldn't forget why she had come. It wasn't for the luxury. It wasn't for the glitz or the glamour. It was for Ethan. For him, she would endure this night, no matter how much it stung. The speeches began just after dessert, with the guests settling into their seats, their eyes fixed on the center of the room where the microphone was set up. The soft murmur of conversation faded into the background as Mark and Claire, standing beside the stage, exchanged quiet words. Laura couldn't help but notice how at ease they were in the setting, how their poised smiles seemed to match the opulence of the room perfectly. It was a world that felt foreign to her, one she didn't belong in, yet here she was, trapped in it for the sake of Ethan. Ethan, as always, seemed oblivious to the growing tension in his mother's chest. He was busy studying the decorations, his eyes wide with wonder as he asked a million questions about the flowers and the candles that adorned every surface. Laura smiled weakly at him, though her heart was far from light. Every moment that passed felt heavier, the weight of the night pressing harder against her chest. She glanced around at the other guests, noticing the way they interacted with one another, so comfortable in their own skin, so at ease with the luxury that surrounded them. She wondered if they ever noticed people like her, sitting quietly at the edge of their world, trying not to draw attention. The first speech began, and the attention in the room shifted. Mark's father stood up with a glass of champagne in his hand, his voice strong and confident as he raised a toast to the happy couple. His words were kind, full of pride and well wishes for the newlyweds. Laura tried to focus on the speech, but the words didn't mean much to her. They were all part of a world she wasn't a part of, a world where people like her didn't fit in. The speech was followed by polite applause, and Laura clapped along with everyone else, her hands moving mechanically as the moment passed by. Claire's parents were next, with Claire's father delivering a heartfelt message about his daughter. The words were sincere, filled with love and admiration, and as Claire's parents spoke, Laura couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. Their daughter, their beautiful, accomplished daughter, was marrying a man who had everything. And here was Laura, still clinging to the remnants of her old life, still fighting to make something of herself, to give Ethan the life he deserved. But as Claire's father finished his speech and returned to his seat, the spotlight shifted once more, this time to Mark. He cleared his throat, stepping up to the microphone with an air of confidence that made Laura feel small in her seat. He spoke of Claire, of how they had met, of their shared dreams for the future. His voice was steady, his words carefully chosen, and as he spoke, his gaze flicked around the room, settling on Laura for just a moment. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough for Laura to feel the sharp sting of his gaze. She couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Did he see her as the sister he had left behind? Did he see her as the failure, the one who hadn't achieved what she should have by now? The speech went on, and Laura tried to focus on the sound of Mark's voice, to find comfort in the familiarity of it. But it was difficult. Mark was a different person now, someone who had moved on to a world where Laura didn't belong. She felt as though she was sitting in a room full of strangers, people who had no idea of the hardships she had endured, people who would never understand what it was like to struggle, to scrape by, just to make sure her son had a roof over his head. The speech ended with a warm round of applause, and Mark made his way back to Claire's side, his arm around her waist. The two of them stood there, smiling and posing for pictures as the photographer moved around the room, capturing moments that would soon become part of their perfect memories. Laura watched them from her seat, her heart heavy as she tried to push aside the jealousy that bubbled up inside her. She couldn't help it. They had everything and she had nothing. Ethan nudged her gently, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Mom, when is the dancing going to start?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. "Soon, sweetie," Laura said, her smile strained. "It'll be a lot of fun, I promise." But as she said it, she realized how much she had been lying to herself. It wasn't going to be fun. Not for her. She had known from the moment she received the invitation that this day would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply it would affect her. The night was just beginning, but already the cracks were starting to show. Laura excused herself from the table and slipped out into the hallway, needing a moment to breathe. The hallway was quiet, the distant sounds of laughter and music faint behind the heavy doors. She leaned against the wall for a moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt completely alone. Her mind raced, her thoughts spiraling. She tried to remind herself that this wasn't her world, and that was okay. She had built her own world, with Ethan by her side. But it was hard not to compare herself to the people she saw here, to the lives they led. Mark had it all, Claire had it all, and here she was, an outsider, a single mother with nothing but a simple dress and the love she had for her son. A voice interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see a familiar figure walking toward her. It was her brother, Mark. His expression was kind, but there was a subtle wariness in his eyes, as though he wasn't quite sure how to approach her. "Laura," he said, his voice gentle. "You okay?" She nodded quickly, wiping away the sudden moisture in her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just needed a moment." Mark stood there for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking at her with an unreadable expression. She could feel the tension in the air, a barrier between them that hadn't been there when they were younger. He was the successful one, the one who had made it. And she, well, she was still here, still struggling, still fighting. "I'm glad you could make it," Mark said finally, his voice soft. "I know things haven't been easy." Laura felt the sting of his words more than she cared to admit. Of course, things hadn't been easy. But hearing him say it aloud, like it was some kind of excuse for their distance, felt like another reminder of the life she had never been able to escape. "I'm here for Ethan," she said, her voice tight. "He wanted to be here. That's all that matters." Mark nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to Ethan, who was still seated at their table. He looked back at Laura, his face softening. "I know," he said quietly. I don't want you to feel out of place here, Laura. You're still my sister." The words were kind, but they didn't reach her. She couldn't help but feel the divide between them, the gap that had grown wider with each passing year. "I'm fine," she said again, more firmly this time. "Really? I just need some air." Mark hesitated, as though he wanted to say more, but instead, he simply nodded and turned to go back into the ballroom. Laura watched him walk away, the sound of his footsteps fading as she leaned against the wall, her heart heavy. She hadn't cried yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. The air outside was crisp and cool, a welcome contrast to the stuffy warmth of the ballroom. Laura stepped into the quiet garden area behind the hotel, her shoes tapping softly against the stone path. She needed space, needed to be alone for just a few minutes, away from the laughter and the polished smiles inside. The night felt surreal, as though she were moving through a dream she couldn't wake up from. Every corner of the evening reminded her that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't a part of this world. She found a small bench near the edge of the garden, tucked away under a large oak tree. It was secluded, hidden from view, and for a moment, it felt like a safe haven. She sank into the seat, her hands folded in her lap, and closed her eyes. The sounds of the celebration inside seemed muffled from here, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Laura let her mind wander. She thought of how she'd ended up here, how her life had taken a path she hadn't expected. She had never imagined being a single mother, never thought that the man she had once loved would walk away from her so easily. The divorce, the years of rebuilding, the constant struggle to make ends meet, it was a life she hadn't chosen, but it was hers now. And for all the pain and hardship, it had made her stronger. But tonight, it felt like she had nothing to show for it. She had worked so hard, and yet, sitting in that room full of people, she felt smaller than she ever had before. The weight of the label on her seat, the way people had looked at her, the way Mark and Claire moved through the room like they owned it, it all reminded her of how much she had lost, how much she still didn't have. She had thought this evening would be a chance to reconnect with her family, to show them that she was okay, that she had moved on. But it felt like she was invisible, like the years of hard work and sacrifice meant nothing to them. Every time someone looked at her, it was as though they were measuring her against some invisible standard, a standard she could never reach. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up, startled to find Ethan standing in front of her. He had followed her outside, his small figure silhouetted against the dim light from the ballroom. His face was filled with concern, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the innocence of a child who couldn't yet understand the weight of the world. Laura smiled at him, though her heart tightened at the sight of him standing there, worried about her. She patted the seat beside her, and Ethan immediately climbed onto the bench next to her, his small body pressing against hers for comfort. "I'm okay, sweetie," Laura said, her voice gentle. "Just needed a little break." Ethan seemed to accept this, his small hand reaching for hers. He sat quietly for a moment, his head resting on her shoulder as they both looked out at the garden. The peaceful quiet of the night, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves, was a welcome relief from the chaos inside. "I don't like seeing you sad, Mom," Ethan said after a while, his voice small but earnest. "You're always smiling for me. You don't need to be sad." Laura's chest tightened at his words, the lump in her throat growing. Ethan had always been her strength, the reason she kept going even when everything seemed impossible. And now, here he was, trying to comfort her when he should be the one being comforted. She pressed a kiss to the top of his head, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm not sad, sweetie," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. I'm just thinking. But don't worry. I'll be okay. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with trust and understanding that only a child could have. Okay, Mom. But I'll always be here if you need me. He hugged her tightly, his small arms wrapping around her, and in that moment, Laura felt a rush of love so strong it almost brought her to tears. She hugged him back, closing her eyes for a moment as the weight of the evening, the sting of the looks, the bitterness of her isolation, all melted away. In his arms, she found a kind of peace, a solace she hadn't realized she needed. Thank you, baby, she murmured into his hair, holding him a little longer than usual. You're my reason for everything. You always will be. Ethan pulled back slightly, his face lighting up with a grin. Can we go back inside now, Mom? I think I'm ready to see the dancing. Laura smiled at him, her heart lightening just a little. Sure. Let's go watch the dancing. I think we could both use some fun. The two of them walked back toward the ballroom, hand in hand. The lights from the windows cast long shadows on the path, and as they entered the grand building again, Laura felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The music was louder now, the energy in the room shifted to something more festive, more carefree. Inside, the guests had started to gather around the dance floor, and the atmosphere seemed to shift as people moved with more ease, laughing and chatting. Ethan pulled her toward the front, his little legs working hard to keep up with the crowd. Can we dance, Mom? He asked, his face full of excitement. Laura hesitated for a moment, looking at the crowd. She didn't belong here, not really. But then she looked down at Ethan, his eyes shining with hope and joy, and she felt her heart soften. Sure, she said, her voice steady. Let's dance. They moved toward the edge of the dance floor, where a few other children were twirling around with their parents. Ethan's hand slipped into hers as the music played, and for the first time that evening, Laura felt something close to normal. She swayed with him, not caring about the crowd around them or the stares from the other guests. It was just her and Ethan, sharing a moment of joy in the midst of everything else. As they danced, the weight of the evening seemed to lift just a little. She wasn't the single mother waitress in that moment. She wasn't the outsider. She was just a mother dancing with her son, and in that simple, perfect moment, it was enough. The music played on, a soft melody that seemed to wrap around them like a comforting blanket. Laura and Ethan moved together in the small space they had claimed on the edge of the dance floor. Ethan was laughing, his face lit with the kind of happiness that only a child could feel, not yet burdened by the weight of the world. Laura couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and love. For a brief moment, everything else faded away. The ballroom, the guests, the unspoken judgment, and it was just the two of them, spinning in their own little bubble of joy. Ethan's tiny feet stumbled as he tried to match the rhythm of the music, and Laura caught him just in time, steadying him with a gentle laugh. Careful there, buddy, she said softly, her hands resting on his shoulders. I'm okay, Mom, Ethan replied with a grin, his eyes sparkling. I just want to dance like the grown-ups. Laura smiled, watching him with affection. He was so full of life, so full of innocence. He didn't care about the labels, the expectations, or the world that often felt like it was set against them. He was just enjoying the moment, and that was something she wished she could do more often. As they continued to dance, Laura caught a glimpse of Mark and Claire standing by the side of the room, watching them. Mark's expression was unreadable, but Claire's face was a mixture of surprise and something else, something that Laura couldn't quite place. It was as though Claire was trying to hide her discomfort, but Laura noticed it all the same. She couldn't help but wonder what Claire was thinking. Was she judging her? Was she surprised to see Laura here at all, dancing with her son, pretending to be a part of this world? Before Laura could dwell on it any further, the music shifted, and the guests around them started to move toward the center of the room for the next dance. Ethan tugged at her hand, his excitement palpable. Mom, let's go. I want to dance with the other kids, he said, pulling her toward the group of children who had gathered. Laura hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the dance floor, where people were now pairing off in couples, swirling around in a choreographed dance. It was beautiful, but it wasn't a world she fit into. She could already feel the weight of the eyes that would follow her and Ethan as they joined the crowd, as if they didn't belong here, because they didn't. They weren't part of this polished world of high society, of luxury and privilege. They were just two people doing the best they could, living in a world that didn't quite have a place for them. But Ethan was pulling her, and for him, she would push aside the self-doubt, the nagging feeling of being an outsider. He wanted to dance with the other children, and that was all that mattered. She didn't want to take that away from him. "Okay, let's go," she said, squeezing his hand as they made their way toward the center of the dance floor. As they moved, she couldn't help but feel the eyes of the guests follow them. There was no mistaking the way the other couples seemed to inch away, subtly avoiding making eye contact as they made room for Laura and Ethan. She could feel the whispers, the silent judgment, as though they were intruding on a private moment that wasn't meant for them. But she kept her head high, pushing through the discomfort for Ethan. They joined the group of children, their bright faces a welcome contrast to the stiffness of the adults around them. Ethan immediately started to dance with the other kids, twirling and laughing, his joy infectious. For a moment, Laura felt a wave of relief. Here, in the midst of everything, her son was happy. And that was enough. She stood on the edge of the circle, watching him dance, her heart swelling with pride. He was a good boy, a smart, caring child who deserved so much more than the world he had been born into. He deserved to feel like he belonged, even in a room full of people who might never understand them. But just as Laura was beginning to settle into the moment, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around to find Beverly standing behind her, her face a mask of forced politeness. Beverly, Mark's mother, was dressed in an expensive gown that shimmered in the light, her silver hair perfectly styled. She looked every bit the picture of grace and wealth. "Laura," Beverly said, her voice dripping with sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was wondering if you could help with something." Laura's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to expect, but she had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. She forced a smile, her eyes flicking toward Ethan, who was still laughing with the other children. "Of course, Beverly. What do you need?" Laura replied, her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. Beverly's eyes glanced briefly at Ethan before returning to Laura. "Well, since you're here, I was hoping you could help with the drinks. I know you're used to working in a restaurant, and it's really just a small request. It'll only take a minute." Laura froze, the sting of Beverly's words hitting harder than she expected. "You want me to help serve drinks?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was it. The moment she had been dreading all evening. The reminder of exactly how they saw her, just a waitress, nothing more. Beverly's smile remained, though it felt colder now. "Yes, dear. It's just a small favor, nothing major. You can go back to enjoying the party afterward." For a moment, Laura stood there, the words sinking in, her mind racing. She could feel her pulse quickening, her throat tightening. Every part of her screamed to turn away, to refuse and walk out of the room. But then she thought of Ethan, her son, laughing and dancing without a care in the world, and something inside her shifted. She couldn't let Beverly's words define her. "Not tonight." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Laura said, her voice more firm than she expected. She straightened her back and turned toward the children, where Ethan was now looking at her with curious eyes. "I'm here to be with my son, Beverly. I think you'll find that's enough." Beverly's eyes flickered with surprise, and for a brief moment, there was tension in the air. But then, without another word, Beverly turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Laura watched her go, her breath shaky, but steadying with each passing second. Ethan ran up to her, his face beaming with excitement. "Mom, I'm having so much fun. This is the best day ever." Laura's heart swelled with love, and she bent down to scoop him into her arms. "I'm so glad, sweetie," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's make this night unforgettable." And for the first time all evening, Laura believed it. She didn't need to be a part of their world, didn't need to fit into their expectations. She had Ethan, and that was more than enough. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, but in a strange way, Laura began to feel a shift in the air. The weight of the initial discomfort that had hung over her like a cloud was starting to dissipate, replaced by a quiet determination. Ethan was still lost in the excitement of the evening, dancing with the other children, running around the room with the carefree energy of a child who had no understanding of the subtle tension that had filled the space earlier. Laura watched him, a small smile tugging at her lips as she leaned against a pillar, feeling the cool breeze from an open door behind her. For the first time that night, she wasn't consumed by the discomfort of being an outsider. She was simply a mother, watching her son have fun. As the night went on, Laura could sense the subtle shift in the crowd around her. The guests, who had once looked at her with subtle disapproval or indifference, were now treating her with a quiet respect. Perhaps it was the way she had stood up to Beverly earlier, or maybe it was just the fact that Laura wasn't trying to force herself into a place where she didn't belong. Either way, the shift was subtle but noticeable. People no longer seemed to look at her with judgment. Instead, they glanced at her with something closer to curiosity, a kind of tentative acknowledgement that she wasn't just the single mother waitress they had initially assumed. Laura knew the change was mostly in her own head, that she had internalized so much of the tension that had surrounded her. But it still felt like a small victory. She was no longer waiting for validation from people who would never give it to her. She had long stopped needing that approval, at least for her son's sake. Tonight wasn't about fitting in, it was about showing Ethan the kind of strength she had fought so hard to cultivate over the years. She turned her attention back to him. He had found a new group of children to play with, a few of them running around in circles, their laughter echoing across the room. The joy was palpable, and for a moment, Laura allowed herself to just watch, to savor the fact that her son was happy. For all the hurt she had carried for so long, all the ways she had felt like she didn't belong, Ethan had a way of making everything seem a little lighter. She leaned against the pillar, letting out a slow breath, her hands resting on the smooth stone. Her eyes scanned the room again, and for the first time that evening, she didn't feel out of place. The voices around her no longer felt like a reminder of how different she was. They were just people, having a good time, just like her. She was here for a reason, because Ethan wanted to be here, because she had made the choice to stand tall, even when everything felt like it was stacked against her. But just as she started to relax, a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Mark. "Laura, can I talk to you for a second?" he asked, his tone more serious than she expected. Laura's heart skipped a beat, and she straightened, unsure of what to expect. It had been a while since they had shared more than pleasantries, and she wasn't sure how to respond to him now. He hadn't really reached out to her since the divorce, at least not in any meaningful way. He had his life, and she had hers, and the distance between them seemed wider every time they crossed paths. "Of course," Laura said, trying to keep her voice even. "What's up?" Mark motioned for her to step away from the crowd, and Laura followed him toward a quieter corner of the room. The music faded slightly as they walked, and she could feel the shift in the air as they moved away from the rest of the guests. When they reached the far end of the room, Mark turned to face her, his expression a mix of hesitation and something else she couldn't quite place. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice low but sincere. "For earlier. For the way things have been between us." Laura's heart tightened. She hadn't expected this. She had been bracing herself for something else, something that might bring her more pain. But this was different. Apologies were rare from Mark, and she wasn't sure how to process it. "There's no need to apologize," Laura said, her voice steady but cautious. "I'm here, aren't I? We're here for Ethan. That's all that matters." Mark shook his head, his expression softening. "No, I mean it. I know things have been awkward between us for a long time. I think I've avoided facing the fact that, well, that I could have been more supportive. I didn't really understand everything you went through after the divorce." Laura looked at him, her chest tightening at his words. She had always wanted him to understand, to truly see her struggles for what they were. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing him acknowledge the pain she had carried, the weight of raising Ethan alone, was something she hadn't expected. She had never asked for his support, never expected him to step in and fix things. But this, his apology, felt like a door opening, even if it was just a crack. "Mark, you don't have to do this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine. I've always been fine. Ethan and I have made it on our own." Mark nodded, his gaze dropping for a moment. "I know you have. But that doesn't make it right. I think I've taken you for granted all these years, and I just wanted you to know that I see you. I see what you've done, what you've gone through. And I'm sorry for not being there for you." Laura's heart fluttered in her chest, the words feeling like a weight being lifted from her. She hadn't realized how much she had longed to hear this from him until now. It wasn't the perfect apology, but it was something she hadn't expected, something she never thought she would get. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." Mark smiled softly, a genuine expression that made him look a little less like the man he had become and a little more like the brother she used to know. "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say it. For both of us." For a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of all that had passed and all that had been left unsaid. It was a small step, but it felt like the first real one in years. Ethan's voice cut through the moment as he ran over, his small feet tapping on the floor. "Mom, can we go get some ice cream now?" he asked, his face lighting up with his usual enthusiasm. Laura couldn't help but laugh, the weight of the evening feeling just a little lighter. "Of course, sweetie," she said, turning back to Mark. "I'll see you around." Mark nodded, offering her one last smile before heading back into the crowd. Laura watched him go, feeling a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. But above all, there was a sense of peace. For the first time all evening, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was room for healing. She took Ethan's hand, his small fingers curling around hers, and together, they made their way toward the ice cream station. The night wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As the evening wore on, Laura found herself slipping into a quiet, peaceful rhythm. The initial tension had faded, replaced by a sense of calm she hadn't expected to find. Ethan was beside her, his face smeared with chocolate from the ice cream they had just gotten, a small price to pay for the joy it had brought him. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of him, so carefree, so innocent. This was the world she wanted for him, one where he could simply enjoy the moments that mattered and not worry about the things that weighed her down. They sat at one of the small tables, the room buzzing with conversation and laughter around them, but for once, Laura didn't feel like an outsider. The whispers and the stares, the way people had looked at her earlier, seemed distant now. She realized, as she watched Ethan happily dig into his dessert, that it wasn't about fitting in with their world, it was about finding her own space within it, for herself and for him. As the music changed, the first notes of a slow song began to fill the room. Couples began to gather on the dance floor, swaying gently to the rhythm. Laura watched them, her eyes scanning the couples, some older, some younger, all moving together in time with the music. For a brief moment, she felt a pang of longing. She remembered when she and Mark used to dance at family gatherings, before everything had fallen apart, before the divorce, before the hurt. But she quickly shook off the thought, pushing it aside. She had learned long ago that the past couldn't be changed, and that there was no use dwelling on things that were lost. She had Ethan, and that was more than enough. He was her reason for everything, and in moments like this, she knew that no matter what had happened before, their future was what truly mattered. Ethan looked up from his ice cream, his eyes wide. "Mom, can we dance too?" he asked, his voice full of excitement. "I want to dance like everyone else." Laura blinked, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She hadn't expected the request, but it was a simple one. Ethan had always been full of surprises, and this was just another reminder of how much he had grown. She looked around the room, watching the couples moving gracefully on the dance floor. She had never expected to be part of that scene, but here was her son, asking her to join in. She looked down at him, his small face full of determination and joy, and in that moment, she knew she couldn't say no. She didn't need to be a perfect dancer or fit in with everyone else. She just needed to be there for him, to show him that she could share in the happiness of the moment, just like any other parent would. "Okay, sweetie," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let's go." They stood up from the table, and she led him to the edge of the dance floor. It was a bit awkward at first. Laura wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially in a place like this, but as the music played, she found herself relaxing. Ethan was full of energy, his little feet tapping to the rhythm, and his excitement was contagious. She couldn't help but laugh as he tried to mimic the moves of the couples around them, his small hands gesturing like he had seen on TV. For a moment, Laura forgot about everything else, the discomfort, the judgment, the past, and just focused on the here and now. The joy in Ethan's eyes, the way he laughed and spun in her arms, was all that mattered. It didn't matter that she wasn't wearing the perfect dress or that her seat had been labeled single mother waitress. None of that mattered in this moment. All that mattered was this, dancing with her son, in the middle of a room full of strangers, and feeling like she had finally found a place where she belonged. Ethan giggled as he spun around, his arms flailing a bit, and Laura spun him gently, holding him close for a moment before letting him go. She could feel his happiness, his sense of freedom, and it made her heart swell. This was the life she had fought for, the one where her son could feel loved and supported, no matter what the world thought of them. As the song continued, the crowd around them seemed to melt away. The once imposing figures of the other guests, the ones who had made her feel like an outsider, were now just background noise. There was no judgment here, no expectations. It was just her and Ethan, lost in the rhythm of the music, and for the first time that evening, Laura felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. When the song ended, Ethan clapped his hands in excitement, his face flushed from the effort. "That was so fun, Mom. Can we do it again?" Laura laughed, breathless from the spinning. "Of course, sweetie. We can dance as much as you want." They danced another round, and then another, their laughter echoing through the room, the music filling the space around them. By now, some of the guests had stopped to watch them, their expressions softened, a few even smiling at the sight of Laura and Ethan spinning around the floor. It wasn't the graceful dance of the other couples, but it didn't need to be. It was perfect in its own way, in a way that no one could take from them. As the night drew on, and the last few songs played, Laura realized that she had stopped worrying about fitting in, about being the odd one out. She didn't need the approval of anyone else. She had her son, and he had her, and that was all that mattered. When the final song of the evening began to play, a soft ballad that seemed to bring everything to a close, Laura and Ethan shared one last dance. She held him close, his small arms wrapped around her neck as they swayed to the music, the world around them falling away. The guests had long since moved to the edges of the room, the dance floor now mostly empty, but Laura didn't care. It was just them, the music, and the quiet understanding that no matter what the future held, they had each other. As the song came to a close, Laura whispered to Ethan, "You're my everything, you know that?" Ethan looked up at her, his face full of trust and love. "I know, Mom. You're my everything too." And in that moment, as the music faded into silence, Laura knew that no matter what anyone else thought of her, she had everything she needed right there with her. She had her son, and that was enough to make this night, this moment, perfect. The evening had come to an end, the last of the guests trickling out of the ballroom, their laughter and chatter fading as the night deepened. The soft glow of the chandeliers dimmed, casting long shadows across the room, and the music had long since stopped playing. The dance floor, once filled with energy, was now empty except for a few scattered chairs and forgotten glasses of wine. Laura and Ethan stood by the door, ready to leave. The night, which had started with so much tension, had transformed in ways Laura hadn't anticipated. What had felt like a world she didn't belong in had become a moment of connection, one where she had found the strength to stand tall, for herself and for Ethan. As they walked toward the exit, Laura felt a sense of calm wash over her, the kind that came with knowing she had done the best she could. She had shown up. She had danced. She had been there for her son, and that was all that mattered. Ethan, tired but happy, skipped beside her, his small hand grasping hers tightly. His energy had finally begun to wane, his earlier excitement turning into a sleepy contentment. Laura smiled down at him, her heart swelling with love for this little boy who had been the reason she kept going, the reason she had fought through the toughest moments of her life. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the sounds of the city were muted, the streets empty except for the occasional passing car. The world outside the ballroom felt different now, calmer, quieter. And in that quiet, Laura felt a deep sense of peace. She had survived the evening. She had been strong in a way she hadn't known she could be. And through it all, Ethan had been by her side, never once questioning her, never once doubting her. They walked toward the taxi waiting by the curb, the driver holding the door open for them. As they climbed in, Ethan immediately leaned against her, his head resting on her shoulder as he yawned. "Mom," he murmured sleepily, his voice soft. "That was the best day ever. I'm glad we went." Laura kissed the top of his head, her hand gently brushing his hair. "I'm glad we went too, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm really proud of you." Ethan's small hand tightened around hers as he drifted off to sleep, the weight of his body relaxed against her. For the first time in a long while, Laura allowed herself to lean back in the seat, closing her eyes for a brief moment. It had been a long night, but it had also been a turning point. She had come to the wedding feeling like an outsider, unsure of her place in a world so different from her own. But as the night unfolded, she had learned something important, that she didn't need to fit into their world to feel valued. She had already built a life, a family, that was enough. And that was something no label, no judgment, could take away from her. The taxi slowly made its way through the quiet streets of the city, the soft hum of the engine filling the space between them. Outside, the night sky was dotted with stars, a few clouds drifting lazily by. For the first time in a long while, Laura felt a quiet sense of hope. She had survived, and in the process, she had found a little piece of herself she hadn't realized she'd lost. As they neared their apartment, the familiar sight of the building brought a sense of comfort. Home. It was where she and Ethan had built their life, where they had weathered the storms together. And as she looked at her son, asleep beside her, she knew they had everything they needed. The taxi pulled to a stop in front of their building, and Laura gently woke Ethan, her voice soft as she whispered, "We're home, sweetie." Ethan stirred, blinking sleepily, and then smiled when he realized where they were. "Home," he said with a sleepy grin, and Laura couldn't help but smile back. They stepped out of the taxi and made their way up to their apartment. Laura held the door open for Ethan as he scampered inside, the familiar warmth of their home wrapping around them like a soft embrace. The evening had been long, but now, in the quiet of their apartment, it felt like they had finally reached the end of their journey for the night. Laura took off her coat, hanging it up by the door, and glanced around their small but cozy living room. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. It was where they had built a life together, through every challenge and every triumph. And as she watched Ethan settle onto the couch, his eyes already drooping from exhaustion, she felt a quiet sense of pride in everything they had accomplished. She sat down beside him, pulling a blanket over them both. Ethan immediately snuggled against her, his head resting on her shoulder once again. "I love you, Mom," he mumbled sleepily. "I love you too, sweetie," she whispered back, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Always." And as the night settled around them, Laura knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She no longer needed the approval of others, no longer needed to prove anything. She had Ethan, and that was everything. For the first time in a long time, Laura allowed herself to close her eyes, her heart at peace. The past had been hard, but it was behind her now. The future was uncertain, but with Ethan by her side, she knew they could handle whatever came their way. And as they drifted off to sleep, the world outside quiet and still, Laura knew that the journey they had started together, the one filled with love, strength, and resilience, was just beginning.